Imagine dedicating your entire life to saving others, only to realize you couldn't even save yourself. Edward Collins had it all. A successful career, a loving family, and a brother he trusted. But in just one moment, everything shattered. A whispered conversation, a betrayal hidden in plain sight, and a storm raging both outside and within. When the hurricane struck, Edward wasn't just fighting the forces of nature, he was planning his escape. But disappearing without a trace isn't easy. And when the past finally comes knocking, will he open the door? The late afternoon sun stretched across the sky, casting elongated shadows over the quiet suburban street as Edward Collins pulled into his driveway. The familiar sight of his two-story home should have brought comfort, yet a strange unease settled in his chest. He had cut his trip short, leaving an environmental summit earlier than planned. Urgency had driven him home, though he couldn't explain why. Stepping out of the car, he surveyed the neighborhood, his trained eyes catching small details others might overlook. Everything seemed ordinary, except for the sleek black sedan parked a few houses down. Gregory's car. His brother's presence wasn't inherently suspicious. Gregory often checked in on Maria when Edward traveled for work. Still, something about it felt wrong today. An instinct sharpened by years of studying unpredictable weather patterns whispered that something was off. Edward approached the house with quiet precision. The key slid into the lock effortlessly, and the door opened with a familiar creak. The air inside was still, save for the low hum of the air conditioning. Too quiet. He stepped inside, his shoes sinking into the plush carpet as he moved through the foyer. His suitcase remained forgotten by the door. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, only that something felt fundamentally out of place. Then a sound. Soft laughter. Muffled voices. Coming from upstairs. His pulse quickened as he ascended the staircase, each step measured yet deliberate. The voices became clearer. He recognized them both instantly. Maria's voice carried a lightness he hadn't heard in years. Edward is always working, always distracted by something bigger than us. Gregory responded, his tone laced with amusement. He never changes. But a woman like you deserves attention, doesn't she? A chuckle followed, shared, intimate. The casual cruelty in their words struck deeper than Edward anticipated. He stopped just outside the bedroom door, which had been left slightly ajar. Through the small gap he saw them. Maria lay across the bed, golden hair cascading over the pillows, her posture relaxed, completely at ease. Gregory sat close, too close. Their bodies weren't tangled in betrayal, but the familiarity in their presence was unmistakable. This was not an innocent exchange. Edward remained still, absorbing the scene. A cold detachment settled over him, pushing aside the initial rush of anger. Years of analyzing the chaos of storms had conditioned him to observe before acting. Reacting without thought only led to destruction. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, retrieving his phone with a steady hand. One tap, and the recording function activated. Their conversation continued, oblivious to the evidence being captured. Edward doesn't even notice. Maria continued, her voice filled with quiet certainty. He's always busy saving the world, and that gives us a lot of time together. Gregory chuckled, his voice dripping with arrogance. He never suspected a thing, too blinded by his own responsibilities to see what's right in front of him. Edward's fingers tightened around the phone. A part of him had expected excuses, whispered denials, at least some hesitation. But no, they spoke freely without fear. They had grown comfortable in their betrayal. For a brief moment, an overwhelming urge surged within him. To step inside, to demand explanations, to let the rage consume him. But he knew better. Confrontation without control led to chaos. And chaos was something he had spent his entire life learning to navigate. Instead, he took a slow step back. Then another. With calculated silence, he turned away, descending the stairs just as carefully as he had come up. The weight in his chest pressed harder with each step, but his mind remained sharp, clear. By the time he reached his car, his decision was made. He slid into the driver's seat, exhaling steadily as he started the engine. His focus needed to be elsewhere now. The storm on the horizon was no longer just a metaphor. A real, relentless force was barreling toward the coast, demanding his attention. As he pulled out of the driveway, leaving the house behind, Edward's thoughts shifted from personal betrayal to professional duty. The hurricane wasn't going to wait for him to resolve his personal life. And neither would he. Edward Collins drove through the rain-slicked streets, his fingers gripping the steering wheel with controlled force. The betrayal he had uncovered just moments ago churned within him like a violent current, threatening to pull him under. But he couldn't allow himself to drown in emotions, not now. A real storm was approaching, one that had no interest in his personal grief. The city streets bore the early signs of the hurricane's arrival. Wind rattled the traffic lights, tree branches bent under the increasing gusts, and rain struck the pavement in erratic bursts. The tension in the air was thick, an unspoken dread that gripped the entire region. The people here had seen storms before, but this one was different. The data showed something unprecedented, something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. By the time Edward reached the weather center, the atmosphere inside was electric with urgency. Rows of monitors displayed real-time satellite images, storm projections, and emergency alerts. The space buzzed with hushed conversations, hurried calculations, and the relentless sound of ringing phones. Teams of meteorologists moved quickly, updating evacuation maps and coordinating with emergency responders. Edward stepped into the controlled chaos and immediately fell into his role. His hands moved across the keyboard with practiced ease, pulling up wind models and tracking the storm's latest movements. Every new frame of satellite data confirmed what they had feared. The hurricane was strengthening rapidly. The winds had reached catastrophic levels, the barometric pressure had plummeted even further, and the storm's trajectory was shifting unpredictably. Outside, the world braced for impact. Yet, even as Edward focused on the numbers, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He ignored it. It buzzed again and again. He finally glanced at the screen. Maria. Dozens of missed calls. A stream of unread messages. Edward, when are you coming home? Please answer me. It's important. We need to talk. His jaw clenched. Now she wanted to talk? Then, a different number flashed across the screen. He recognized it instantly. Gregory. Edward let the phone ring, his fingers tightening around the device. He wanted nothing more than to throw it against the wall, to silence it forever. But something in him stilled. He answered. The voice on the other end was frantic, barely coherent. The unmistakable panic of a man who had lost control. Edward, we need help. The streets are flooding. Water's rising too fast. Maria and I. Edward ended the call before Gregory could finish. For several seconds, he simply sat there, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They had betrayed him, lied to him, used him, and now, when they were drowning, they turned to him. A bitter irony twisted through his chest. He could ignore them, let them face the consequences of their choices. Let them see what it felt like to be left with nothing. But logic overruled emotion. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself back into the present. The storm didn't care about his anger, nor did the people who relied on him. He had made a career out of studying forces greater than himself, and this was no different. His fingers moved quickly as he accessed the emergency rescue database. Resources were already stretched thin, but he located a nearby team and marked Gregory and Maria's address as a priority. That was all he would do. Nothing more. The storm was now their problem. As he resumed his work, a familiar voice cut through the tension. Emma. She stood at his side, arms crossed, watching him carefully. You're quiet, she noted. Edward kept his eyes on the screen, just focused. She didn't push, but she didn't leave either. Instead, she studied the storm projections alongside him. It's getting worse, she murmured, eyes narrowing at the data. Edward adjusted a few settings, refining the projections. We need another evacuation alert. The trajectory shift puts more areas at risk. Emma nodded, already preparing the updates. Around them, the weather center was alive with movement, scientists recalibrating models, officials making urgent phone calls, reports coming in from coastal stations. The hurricane was accelerating, its outer bands already hammering the shore. Outside, emergency sirens wailed in the distance. Edward's phone buzzed once more. Another message. "Edward, please. We need your help." Maria's words burned against the screen. Edward turned the phone over, face down. The storm was the only thing that mattered now. For the next several hours, he buried himself in work. His world became wind speeds, tidal surges, pressure differentials. He guided evacuation plans, issued critical updates, and helped coordinate the movement of emergency teams. His voice, calm and steady, carried through conference calls and radio transmissions, directing first responders through the chaos. But even as he saved others, a single thought lingered in the depths of his mind. Once the storm passed, once the last raindrop fell and the skies cleared, he would have to return home, to the ruins of everything he had once believed in. The storm had left devastation in its wake. The coastal city, once bustling with life, now stood partially submerged. Flooded streets reflected broken power lines, shattered glass, and remnants of homes torn apart by the hurricane's fury. Emergency sirens wailed across the city, their echoes bouncing off ruined buildings as responders waded through the wreckage, searching for survivors. Inside the weather center, the frantic pace of work had begun to slow. The worst of the storm had passed, though its effects would linger for weeks, if not months. Edward Collins sat at his workstation, fingers skimming across the keyboard, compiling the final reports that would be used for post-storm analysis. His colleagues spoke in hushed tones, exhausted yet relieved that they had helped minimize the loss of life. But Edward felt none of that relief. Even as he stared at the data in front of him, his mind was elsewhere. The betrayal he had uncovered before the storm still festered like an open wound, deep and raw. Maria and Gregory had spent years deceiving him, hiding in plain sight, all while he had devoted himself to his work, believing he was protecting something real. It had all been a lie. The weight of it pressed heavily on him, but there was no space for grief. Not yet. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. A number he hadn't seen in years. He hesitated before answering. The voice on the other end was measured, professional. Oliver Ford, the private investigator he had once hired to oversee corporate security for the family business. "We need to meet," Oliver said. "I found something you should see." Edward didn't ask questions. He simply agreed. The private investigator's office was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of old books and stale coffee. A ceiling fan hummed overhead, its slow rotations doing little to alleviate the humidity left in the storm's aftermath. Edward sat across from Oliver, watching as the investigator spread out a collection of documents across his desk. "This isn't just about an affair," Oliver said, his tone serious. "It's bigger." Edward's gaze moved across the pages, financial reports, bank statements, transaction records. Numbers lined the sheets in neat rows, but beneath them lay a tangled mess of deception. The business, the one he had built alongside his father, had been bleeding money for years. Millions gone. Gregory and Maria hadn't just betrayed him in their personal lives. They had been stealing from him, from the very company he had spent decades protecting. Edward remained still, absorbing the full scope of their betrayal. They hadn't been content with ruining his marriage. They had wanted more. They set up offshore accounts, Oliver continued, sliding another folder toward him. Fake suppliers, ghost employees, textbook embezzlement. But it wasn't just the two of them. Someone else was involved. An accountant who specializes in corporate fraud. I'm still tracking him down. Edward flipped through the documents, each page confirming what he already suspected. They had been planning this for a long time. His brother and his wife. The two people he had once trusted most. Oliver hesitated before pushing a final envelope across the table. "There's something else." Edward took it without a word. He already knew what it contained. The results of a paternity test. His hands were steady as he unfolded the paper, his eyes scanning the familiar medical jargon. But the result was simple. Anna was not his daughter. He had suspected it for years, though he had never allowed himself to voice the thought. The timing, the subtle inconsistencies, the way Maria had always brushed aside questions. It had been there, lingering beneath the surface. He had just never wanted to see it. Now he had no choice. Edward closed the folder and exhaled slowly. The storm had taken lives, but this revelation felt like the real disaster. He had spent 14 years raising a child who wasn't his, loving a girl who had been the product of a lie. His entire world had been built on deception. "What do you want to do?" Oliver asked, his voice careful. Edward sat in silence for a long moment. Then he straightened. "Prepare everything," he said, his voice controlled. "Gregory is out of the company. Maria gets nothing from the divorce. And Anna," he hesitated, just for a moment, "she will be taken care of. But she will never know about this test." Oliver nodded, understanding the unspoken weight of that decision. "I'll handle it." Edward rose from his chair, gathering the documents in a measured, precise manner. The storm had passed, but the wreckage it had left behind was still being uncovered. And now it was time for him to become the storm. The storm had ravaged the coastline, leaving behind a city still struggling to recover. Buildings stood battered, their facades stripped by relentless winds, while roads lay beneath murky floodwaters. In the wake of the disaster, businesses attempted to reopen, families sorted through debris that had once been their homes, and emergency crews worked tirelessly to restore power. Edward Collins had seen the aftermath of many storms, but this time, he wasn't focused on rebuilding. This time, he was disappearing. The betrayal had been absolute. The woman he had loved, the brother he had trusted, and the child he had raised, none of them had been what they seemed. Maria and Gregory had stolen from him, both in ways that could be measured in dollars and in ways that could not. The life he had built, the purpose he had believed in, had all been nothing more than an illusion. He had spent weeks preparing, moving methodically, leaving no detail unchecked. The first step had been financial. Edward liquidated what assets he could, carefully transferring funds to secure locations that no court, no lawyer, and certainly not his former family could reach. He moved quietly, ensuring that every financial trail led to dead ends, that every transaction appeared as part of a storm recovery effort rather than an escape. The second step had been legal. His attorney, Daniel Harris, had executed the final moves necessary to sever all ties. Gregory had been removed from the company, his access revoked, his reputation destroyed by the overwhelming evidence of financial misconduct. Maria had been left with nothing. The divorce had been swift and absolute, her legal representation powerless against the airtight case built against her. There had been no final conversations, no confrontations, just silence. And then, the final step, his disappearance. The world still thought of him as Edward Collins, a renowned meteorologist and disaster specialist. But Edward Collins was about to vanish. He crafted the illusion carefully. A vacant hotel room, a rental car that would never be returned, flight bookings made with no intention of being used, a strategically placed personal item near the flooded coast. Everything pointed to one logical conclusion, that, in the chaos following the hurricane, Edward Collins had been lost to the storm. The reports came in as expected. Authorities listed him among the missing. Search teams scoured the coastline, their efforts hindered by lingering floodwaters and washed-out roads. News outlets carried his name, pairing it with the storm's aftermath, a tragic loss of yet another life dedicated to saving others. And while the world mourned a man they believed to be gone, Edward walked away. By the time his name appeared on official missing persons lists, he had already crossed state lines. The new identity had been carefully constructed over months, woven together with the same precision he had once used to track storms. George Hamilton. The name had no history, no connection to the past he was leaving behind. He had chosen it deliberately, ensuring that it would never be tied to the betrayals that had once defined him. From the outside, it looked like he had been swallowed by the very forces he had dedicated his life to understanding. But in truth, Edward Collins had not been claimed by the storm. He had become it. Years had passed since Edward Collins had vanished. The world had moved on as it always did. His name had become another entry in the official records of lives lost to the storm, a respected meteorologist who had disappeared in the aftermath of one of the most devastating hurricanes in history. News reports had briefly covered the tragedy, colleagues had expressed their grief, and search teams had eventually given up hope. But Edward had not perished. Far from the storm-ravaged city he had once called home, a man named George Hamilton now lived a quiet existence on the shores of New Zealand. The coastline here was different, rugged and untouched, the waves a constant rhythm against the rocky cliffs. The air smelled of salt and freedom, a world away from the suffocating weight of his past. His life was simple. He had built a career in environmental research, working under a new identity with a quiet passion that required no public recognition. The work was meaningful, but more importantly, it belonged to him. There were no betrayals lurking in the background, no hidden lies waiting to surface. The house he had chosen was modest, nestled between the trees with a view of the open sea. It was a place of solitude, a place where he could exist without expectation. The storm that had once defined his life had long since passed, leaving behind the kind of peace he had never known before. And then there was Alice. She had come into his life gradually, never prying into the past he never spoke of. She had accepted the version of him he had chosen to share, offering quiet companionship rather than questions. With her, there was no need for explanations. She joined him at the edge of the deck, where he stood watching the sunset stretch across the water. "You're thinking again," she murmured, her voice laced with familiarity. He exhaled, the corners of his lips lifting slightly. "Old habit." Alice smiled but said nothing more. She had long since learned that some thoughts were meant to stay unspoken. Instead, she slipped her hand into his, grounding him in the present. "Here, now." But the past had a way of surfacing, even when buried beneath years of silence. The call came unexpectedly. An unfamiliar number, but with a country code he recognized immediately. He hesitated before answering. The voice on the other end was professional, detached. A representative from the United States State Department. "Mr. Hamilton, we're reaching out regarding a legal matter involving Edward Collins." His grip on the phone tightened. The official continued, their tone measured. Edward Collins had been declared legally dead. After years of unanswered questions, unclosed investigations, and failed leads, the court had finalized the matter. His estate had been settled, his legal ties erased. Edward Collins was no more. George Hamilton was all that remained. The call ended, leaving behind a silence heavier than before. Alice watched him, sensing the shift in his demeanor. "Everything okay?" He turned to her, meeting her gaze. They finally let him go. She didn't ask for details. She simply nodded, understanding more than she let on. But the past had one final visitor. The knock came late in the evening, sharp and deliberate. He wasn't expecting anyone. Their home was remote, chosen precisely for its isolation. Yet someone had found him. When he opened the door, the years collapsed into a single moment. Maria. The woman before him was a shadow of who she had once been. Her elegance had faded, replaced by exhaustion and desperation. The confidence she had once carried was gone, leaving behind only hollow eyes and trembling hands. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then her voice cracked. "Edward, I need your help." The name felt foreign to him now. She shook her head, barely holding herself together. "It's Anna. She's in trouble." The name struck something deep, but he didn't let it show. "She's in jail. Gregory, he's gone. The money's gone. I have nothing left." He watched her carefully, feeling nothing. No anger, no grief, just detachment. Reaching into a drawer by the door, he pulled out a folder. The papers inside had been kept for years, untouched but never forgotten. He tossed them at her feet. "The test results," he said simply. "She was never mine." Maria knelt, her hands shaking as she picked up the papers, her breath hitching as she read the truth that had unraveled everything. Tears welled in her eyes, but they no longer had any meaning. "You made your choices," he said, his voice calm. "Live with them." And with that, he shut the door. Alice was waiting, She had seen the exchange, but she didn't ask. She simply placed a gentle hand on his arm, anchoring him once more in the present. He turned away from the door, away from the ghosts of the past. The storm had long since cleared, and for the first time he was truly free.